Welcome, everyone. So I see that people are still pouring in, so I'll give it a few more minutes before we get going. Okay, so it's time to get started. So welcome to this webinar named Sky's the Limit with XSOAR. So my name is Eirik Ballerhaug. I'm a senior systems engineer specialist for the Cortex Nordics team from Palo Alto Networks. So today we'll talk a little bit about Prisma and XSOAR and how these work together in order to help organizations create a more dynamic and secure cloud environment. So if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll address them either immediately or at the appropriate time. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about Prisma itself, what it is and what it does and what the purpose of that solution is. And then I'll move on to the XSOAR platform. And then ultimately we'll see how these work together. And if time permits, I will also add another live demo at the end, which wasn't originally planned, but seeing is believing, right? So let's talk a little bit about Prisma. So the cloud is redefining how applications are built. So there are three main pillars to this. So first of all, of course, the cloud is now driving a big application modernization. So I'm sure you all know that there are a lot of apps out there or are either born in the cloud or are now cloud native. So as many as 80% are also a part of this journey. The other part is that the containers have now gone mainstream. So 7% of the global enterprises will be running more than 2 containerized apps by 2023. So of course, that's also another platform that we need to take into consideration. And also, most customers or more businesses, 81% or so, use 2 or more different cloud vendors like AWS, Azure, Google, and so on. So when you consider the security aspect of this, there are a lot of fragmentations going on. So of course, you have the cloud service provider. They have their own tools, which can be leveraged. You have, of course, do-it-yourself projects where the customers try to build things on their own. We have, of course, open source tools that are free, but also require a lot of maintenance. And then, of course, we have specific point products or point solutions that take aim to solve a piece of the puzzle, but ultimately, of course, results in many different products that need to be acquired and maintained. Examples like CASB, CSPM, CWPP, and so on. And the sort of the combining factor is that there's a lot of faults that are going to be made, of course, and most of these will actually be the customer's fault. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's because they are stupid or unable to do it properly or so on, but the human factor, as we'll see, plays a vital role into how these issues occur and how we need to solve them going forward. So in order to be secure or as secure as you can be, we need to protect every resource. And we also need to do this through the entire life cycle. And we have to do this across multiple clouds. So if you look at every resource, that means basically things like internet as a service or infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, containers, serverless, and advanced cloud services, basically any asset. We also need to take a look at the entire life cycle. So that means that we have to do everything from continuous integration, continuous development pipelines, all the way through to the deployment of the applications, how they're developed and how they're presented to the customer. Because all the different aspects are potential security threats or vulnerabilities that can be exploited by attackers. And like I said, we also need to make sure that we do this across any cloud vendor. There are a lot of vendors out there. Of course, the primary ones are AWS, Azure, GCP, Alibaba, and so on. So we need to make sure that we do this, and also for private cloud environments. So obviously, we have a vision of how we want to do this. So the vision, obviously, is then to build the most comprehensive security and compliance solution for the public cloud environment. So starting with the CSPM 1.0, we're looking at config and compliance monitoring. And then we add another layer, so to speak, is when we look at the network threat detection and UBA, which is user and endpoint behavior analytics, looking at abnormal behaviors versus normal behaviors, not only to the user himself, but also versus his peers. Then moving on to looking at the workload protection, host, containers, and serverless, and ultimately moving over to the CNSP, where data, user, network, and application security also play a vital role. So we aim to do all of these things. So a bit more specifically, the product strategy. So we want to enable our customers to use any cloud and adopt any cloud solution by building the best-in-class security and compliance capabilities through all the phases of the life cycle of the given application. So if you consider the history of Palo Alto, where Palo Alto came from the firewalls back in the day, one of the first things we were looking at was the visibility. Knowing that the only thing that really makes sense is that if you don't have visibility, you really can't protect anything. So starting with the visibility is a very vital and important part of this journey. Let's see, I have some questions here if I can get them up and in here. Just a second. So I'm not seeing the Q&A. If you can put them in chat instead, that would be great, because I'm having troubles with the Q&A. Yes, so the visibility part, obviously, and then we need to assess the configuration. We need to provide reports on how the compliance is looking versus regulatory demands. We need to consider the network security, which is part of the prevention, of course. Then we need to do the detection with identity and access management. We have to look at the security workload, of course, the security of the data itself, and then provide automated response, which is basically what we're going to look further into today, the automation of how to respond. Yes, the recording is not just for internal use, so this will be made available to everyone. Okay, so that was a very high level approach to Prisma. So let's talk a little bit about XSOAR. So XSOAR is, of course, something that a lot of vendors reference to. And we added the X in front of it because we believe, of course, that we need to be able to have an extended SOAR solution, meaning that we'll be integrating virtually into anything and being able to be used for anything, as we'll take a look at shortly. Now, we tend to try to make products to solve problems. Of course, we need to identify the problems first before we try to solve them. So if we look at security operations today, they're really, really cumbersome in many cases. So you have a SecOps team, and the SecOps team have to get information. And that information is spread all over the place. It can be in different technical solutions like SIEMs, vulnerability scanners, firewalls, ADs, and so on. And all of these have different GUIs and CLIs. So the front end of the solutions differ wildly. The format of the information is also different. So this is a very manual process of getting the data. It might also be that they can't access directly. They have to speak to other teams, could be IT ops or the CISO for that matter, or ticketing systems or anything like that. And all of this is typically very manual. So not only is it requiring a lot of manual work, it also increases the likelihood of something going wrong. There's also the element of fatigue and repetitiveness that also burns out the SecOps people, but also the chance of making incorrect decisions increases when you do the same thing over and over again. So basically, this very manual process involving multiple teams, multiple technologies, different UIs, different CLIs, different formats, and so on, is basically a very, very long and painful process that completely overwhelms the socks of most people out there. So we aim to solve this, obviously, with Cortex XSOAR. Now, there's a lot to XSOAR as a platform, obviously, but there are a few highlights that we want you to consider from this webinar. And if you consider then the alert sources. So XSOAR is a tool which integrates with more than 560 native integrations. So these range from SIMs through vulnerability management to enrichments like AD and multiple vendors across the entire IT industry. So what we rely on is typically is that we have solutions that will generate alerts, and these alerts will be then either sent or pulled by XSOAR. Once we get these alerts, we'll then process and classify them into specific incident types. And based on the incident types, we'll then run specific playbooks or workflows, if you will. And these workflows then define all the automated steps that we go through until we reach a decision or the end of the actual automation. So it could either be completely automated, or it could be partially automated, or it could be a mix of manual and automation processes. We'll take a look at that as well. One of the really big important things with XSOAR is that it's very visual. So as you can see from the screenshot below here, you can see all these green boxes. And these are basically actions or automations that typically is a single command or a script that we have made beforehand. So you don't have to be a coder in order to use this. You just have to drag and drop actions that connect these things together and in order to make advanced automations. And of course, we have predefined hundreds of these playbooks, thousands of actions, so you can very easily get started and just change a small thing here and there in order to get going and modify it to your specific needs. So the visual representation is really important in order to make a simple solution to advanced things. Now, the automation and response is one thing. And then we have the incident management. Like we talked about before, there's a lot of alerts going on out there, right? And they're in different systems. So by combining all of them into this system, you will then, first of all, have a full ticketing system already in the solution. Of course, we do integrate with existing ticketing systems you might have, like Jira or ServiceNow or similar, and they're bidirectional, meaning we can both create and read from these ticketing system or update them. So you can then have a single pane of glass to have all your incidents from your entire organization in one single place. And here, of course, we get all the data. You can manage it in a single spot. And then, of course, you can have multiple teams working in the same environment to have good control in one single place. Now, further extending that to the right, we talk about collaboration and learning. And the point here is that, like I said before, you can then give access to, on a very, very granular level, different teams, what they should be able to connect to and see. It's also possible to invite analysts from teams into helping on specific cases. You can also, of course, have this solution put in a so-called MSSP manner, which means that we can have subtenants inside the solution which are completely separate. So we can support that kind of topology as well. But the whole idea, of course, here is to have a single platform which can automate and orchestrate everything you have and provide specific and context-based information relevant to the different teams in one single UI. And this, of course, will then make it much easier, both with collaboration, automation, incident management, and so on. Now, that aside, how do these two things work together? How does Prisma Cloud and Cortex XDR work together? So let's move on. Now, like I said before, we try to do things in order to solve problems rather than creating problems. So if we look at how things would be done normally before you have the XSOAR integration, is that you will have a SecOps normally that will then look at data and information coming from many different sources, including Prisma Cloud in this case. So you will have data from Google, from AWS, you will have ticketing systems, you will have firewalls, you will have Prisma Cloud, you might have different teams and admins that will provide different kinds of information and input. And of course, this is all very manual. And that means, of course, that you might have things that go wrong. You might make the wrong decision. You might put in the wrong information. You might forget to document something. And also, it's usually very repetitive, and people tend to get burned out or even have a higher degree of errors when you do the same thing over and over and over again. Add to that the products and teams are siloed with different policies in place that are manual. You might have to wait for information. Someone might be sick. You have the information that is formatted differently, and so on and so forth. This becomes a very, very lengthy and very cumbersome process, obviously. Now, I see that I have some questions in the Q&A, and for some reason, I'm not getting the window to pop up. So if you can post your questions in the chat, that would be highly appreciated. Thank you. Now, the after scenario is, of course, when we put XSOAR into play. Now, the way it works, as I said before, is that XSOAR can integrate natively to more than 560 pre-made integrations. So there's a huge, huge list of supported products. And the way it works is that we use APIs to connect to the different integrations. So Prisma Cloud obviously has an API, but that does AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Alibaba, and so on also have. So in this case, we use then the API to connect to Prisma Cloud, which again is connected to AWS, Azure, and Google in this example. And either through that integration or directly, we can also connect to AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud with XSOAR. And the point here, obviously, is that we'll be able then to get information and alerts both directly from Prisma Cloud or AWS, Azure, Google Cloud at the same time. And we can also use the API to pull more information. So if something occurs somewhere, we can then use the APIs to ask for more information from Prisma, AWS, Azure, and so on. We can also use other integrations we have for enrichments. So the enrichments, of course, can then get more information into XSOAR to make better decisions. So the way we do this, of course, is again using APIs. And this could be to the connections I mentioned here. But as you see in the green box here, we can also connect to a lot of other different vendors to ask what they think about something. An example could be, for instance, if we get an alert that says we might have a malware here, then we can turn around, we can check the hash versus multiple different connections we have to other vendors to say, do you think this is malware? And based on their feedback, we can make a better decision. So ultimately, what we want to do is to get as much data about a specific incident so that the automation we do in terms of response is based on a better decision criteria than just a single alert, for instance. Now, I can see I get a question here. So with XSOAR, why would you invest in TIM Edition? Okay, So XSOAR itself is a full automation automation response tool, as you know, and it relies on the integrations it has. So we can integrate then to, like I said, vendors that can tell us whether or not a hash is malicious or indicators of compromise is malicious. But this is something we do after the fact. So that means if we have an incident, we'll then turn around and poll these for information. Now, the question was about TIM edition. So TIM is Threat Intel Management. In these cases, we are not just polling for, what do you think of this hash or this IOC? We're actually then downloading the entire feeds to the XSOAR solution, keeping the full database. Now, there are multiple advantages to this. First of all, obviously, since we have the full database, we can then use this information to do, if a delta in the verdict happens, we can use that delta change. For instance, if something goes from good verdict to bad verdict, to trigger specific playbooks. That's one thing. The other thing we can do, of course, is that we can then keep a full history of all the verdict changes, comments that were made and so on. But also, to a lot of customers that have multiple threat feeds, we also now have the capability of correlation. So we can then take multiple threat feeds, correlate them in XSOAR, and then we can say this is sort of the master feed, or this is the combined verdict on all the threat feeds we have. So instead of then manually having to decide whether an indicator is bad or not, we can base it on trust and verdicts from multiple sources to automatically say this is the most likely or this is the best verdict we have. Now, there are other things we can do as well with this. We can, of course, then create exports. So for instance, we can export a feed that you can then use based on the correlation, for instance, in your firewalls to automatically block bad indicators in sort of like in an external or dynamic block list. Now, I got another question. Tim will have millions of indicators of compromise. How will that perform the performance of XSOAR? That's an excellent question. And of course, it will have a negative impact. That is why TIM is actually a separate SKU and will be run on a separate machine that has the database. So it will not run on the same platform as is doing XSOAR. Everything will be managed through one UI. Everything will be seen and presented in one UI, but the TIM itself will be residing on a different server that's been managed by the XSOAR. And of course, this will be then scaled to the level of threat feed indicators you are receiving per day. So we, of course, have scaling numbers for that. So if you're going with TIM, you'll be running it on a separate server, and based on the thresholds, you might be running servers like Elasticsearch, for instance, if you have millions of IOCs. So ultimately, that will not impact the performance of XSOAR as such. We'll simply then, let's call it outsource the TIM functionality onto a separate server. That is true both for the cloud and on-prem. So I hope that was an answer to your question. And I'll move on, and please fire up more questions if it wasn't clearly defined. So I can show you as well if you want to see it afterwards. Now, the value proposition in this case, of course, I'll pop back again since I was answering a question, is that the integrations we have between these different vendors and also, of course, internal resources on-prem like EDR, SIEM systems, UEBA, ticketing, and so on, and also, of course, enrichment through the more specific features in the cloud. The value proposition is, of course, that we can take this information automatically and perform remediation. And that removes a very heavy toll that is put on the SecOps personnel. So first of all, it removes the element of error that humans have a tendency to make. It also removes a huge workload from the analysts so they can spend their time on the more advanced stuff that still require human intervention, so to speak. And of course, we can then do the remediation at a much higher reliability factor based on the enrichment that we do. The other part is that since we have all these connections, we can then provide an unprecedented visibility into what happened across the entire organization. Remember that when something happens, we'll do enrichment from many different sources, gather data, and collect it into one single view, one single ticket with all the different data, visibility into how it happened across the entire organization, the results, the outcome, and everything is formatted in what we call a normalized view, as I'll show you as well. So this gives a very, very high level of visibility. Now, we also talked a little bit about coordination. So it's very important as well that even if we correlate everything into a single system, it doesn't really help that much if the teams still have to connect directly onto the system and manage them. So different teams will have different needs. So the IT admin guys might want to only see a specific thing. The CISO might want to see a specific thing. The SecOps want to see something. DevOps might want to see something else. So we can provide this in one single solution through different views, dashboards. We can also, like I said before, have a multi-tenant solution where we have sub-tenants even running on the same platform. So that means that you can actually have then a single pane of glass, a uniform platform where everyone can work and get the information they need. And this, of course, is also both time consuming and also makes communication across multiple teams and collaboration much, much easier. So we're going to move on to some specific examples of how this works. Now, obviously, this is high level, but we can see the actual use cases, how the thought process behind it is. If you have specific questions, feel free to fire them off to me. And like I said before, if time permits, I'm going to show you a live demo as well of an incident where we're actually addressing some of these things. But before I move on, do you have any questions? And please put them in the chat that I haven't addressed yet. No questions? Okay, then we'll move on. So in this case, we're looking at a use case where AWS in the identity and access management policy has been misconfigured or might even have a default that's not good enough on the basis of what the actual organization requires. So if we look at the challenges, and again, of course, we're generalizing here, is that it actually shows that 80% of security breaches today in the cloud, in this case, involve some sort of privileged credentials that have gone awry. And most of these cases actually have misconfigurations in them. So just by making sure we don't have misconfigurations, we're going to make the attack surface a lot lower and thus, of course, reducing our risk. So there are, of course, multiple problems, but if we look at it from the most severe ones, we have the problem of there's no automated checks and automation on the management of keys and multi-factor authentication enforcement. The other thing is that in larger organizations, you might have thousands of roles, which then define hundreds of permissions. And of course, it's really, really difficult to maintain all of this and make sure that we follow the principle of least privilege, i.e., don't give anyone more access than they actually need. So with thousands of roles and hundreds of permission tags on off, of course, it's easy to make a mistake or opening more than you should. The other one is that even if you look for these things, how do you know it's bad? So in that respect, we also need to look at things from anomaly view, saying that, okay, this is abnormal versus normal use. So this could be, for instance, that we can see that the access key has been compromised somehow. And we can do this in multiple ways, obviously looking at where the actual signing comes from, the way it's being used, and so on. And this can look, it can be on, like I said, a location, geolocation. It could be like someone is brute forcing something or trying to go into something they normally don't access. And if you have multiple login failures and stuff like that, these are things we need to monitor in order to detect if something has gone horribly wrong. Now, what you're seeing here is a high-level suggestion around how we can make a playbook, as we call it, on this specific challenge. So first of all, we're doing ingestion. So that's basically when we're pulling information from a source. In this case, it could be a Prisma Cloud or directly from the vendor or both. So when we get information in, the first thing we need to do is to classify it. What kind of incident is this? Of course, if it's information about misconfiguration, we're not going to label it as malware or anything like that. So the first thing we need to do is classify it. So we classify the alert and map it into a specific incident type, which creates an incident or ticket, if you will. And the specific incident type defines which playbook or automated response, if you will, that runs. And in this case, it has defined a set of actions. So the first thing it does is it gets the account's password policy. So what's the policy currently in play? And we then tell the owner of the account that we are working on the case, and we then choose whether or not to auto remediate. So that is basically something we decide, do we need to automatically switch something on and off? So that could mean that, okay, if, for instance, we detect that the setting doesn't say that you have to have a number in your password, maybe we automatically want to flip that to on and then notify the user again, say that, please change your password, something like that. So we can then automatically look at all the different settings that we can control for the password management, for instance, for a specific role. So we can automatically check that everything is according to what the business has set is the requirement for passwords. So no human has to be involved. We automatically check it, and we can also automatically fix it to set the proper requirement for the password, for instance. Again, it's completely possible to not do it like this. Maybe you want some sort of a final check by an analyst or something like that. The whole point is that we can fully automate everything, or we can also then add manual steps in between if you so wish. So based, of course, then on what we find, we may or may not remediate the policy settings. Another example is, for instance, if you have misconfigured your EC2 instance in AWS. Now, it's very common to have different resources out there, obviously, but it's also very common to have a misconfiguration, or maybe you just forgot to close it and stuff like that. So you might have a lot of services, could be network segments, could be APIs, it could be servers with open ports directly exposed to the internet. So in these cases, these have a potential of being abused, obviously. So how do we figure out if this is the case, and what do we do with it? So first of all, of course, we need visibility. We need to find out whether or not there are ports that are open, security groups that aren't properly set up. We need to see, is there traffic coming in to an IP port or service that shouldn't receive traffic? Can we see any attributes of a user that have changed that might indicate that there's a breach going on or an attempt like that? The other part, of course, is we need to make sure that we do this continuously. The whole point of the cloud is, of course, speed and agility. So that means that developers, admins, people that create stuff and use stuff, these move fast. So there's a lot of change, there's a lot of development, there's a lot of movement going on all the time. And of course, we need to make sure that as these shift and move around, that the security then, of course, is also updated and in place, even if things move around. And the lack of remediation then that's handled automatically means that suddenly you might find yourself that you have moved something, or an IP has changed, or you deploy something new that's more exposed than it should be. And that, of course, now requires manual labor to detect, and it's a huge, huge challenge. So we need, of course, automation to detect and remediate these things as well. The other thing is that normally security is only done in runtime. So that means that you deploy the application and then you see if there are any breaches. What we need to do is to ensure that we also can check for this in the entire development life cycle, even before it actually gets deployed to the internet. So we can tell the coders that there's something potentially damaging in the code before they actually compile it and send it on to the web. And again, this is something that we need to do automatically, or it won't happen, or it will take too long. So here we can see an example of Prisma with the investigation that you can do manually and so on. And we need to do this automatically. So here's an example of a playbook that takes this into consideration. So as you already know, we start by getting information into XSOAR. So in this case, we're getting the information directly from Prisma. So the first thing it does, as normally, is to classify what kind of incident is this. Is it a malware? Is it a configuration issue, or this or that? And based on the incident type, we then create the incident ticket, and then we go ahead and run the automation. In this case, that means get the misconfig type. What kind of misconfiguration is it? Is it a password misconfiguration? Is it exposure of security groups and so on? And of course, we then notify the owner that we are seeing something, we're working on this. And then the question becomes, should we automatically remediate or not? Now, the next step is then, where's the actual issue we're trying to fix? Is it internet ports or ports with TCP exposed to the internet? Or is there something wrong with the security group of the instance itself? Now, these point to what we call sub playbooks. So in here, you can see that a sublook then basically is its own playbook with its own defined actions and so on that you can point to from the main playbook. And the reason we do this is that, for instance, a sub-playbook like parse email can be used in many different cases where email is involved. So instead of reinventing the wheel every time, we then basically just point to sub-playbooks. I'll also see if I can show you this in the demo afterwards. Now, the sub-playbook, in this case, then gets more information. Like I said, it's now actually doing enrichment. I want to know more about what happened, the implications, so on, so I automatically can make a more informed decision. So in this case, we're getting information about the security groups, how they're configured, and so on. The next thing we do is do the remediation. So it can then spawn parallel sessions, or it could be a tiebreaker if the answer is 1 or 0, yes or no, blue or red, doesn't really matter depending on the logic. So in this case, for instance, you have split into 2 different branches. To the right, it says that the default security does not restrict all traffic, for instance. If that's the case, then we do another check. Is there a default security group? Revoke all security group ingress rules. Did it work? Did we receive an error? If not, okay, fine, we're done. If not, we'll have to do this manually, for instance. There could be other things. It could be that the security group allows internet traffic, at which point we revoke it. And then we check for the latest security details. Are they updated properly? Do we have any public rules? Do we need to do anything manually? And so on. So all of these things then happen manually so that the analyst or the SOC operators don't have to do this. And yes, we will provide you with a link to the recorded session. Now, there were two sub-playbooks. So we're just looking at this one, but we also had this one. So that's when the issue wasn't the security group itself. It was more that the internet traffic was allowed to TCP ports XYZ. So again, we're then taking the information based on the classification. It's a sub-playbook. We create another ticket. And then, of course, we get information about the IP permissions. And we also look at the TCP public security group rules. How are they created and so on? Do we need to remediate anything? If the answer is yes, we'll automatically then revoke. If the answer is no, then of course we'll tell the analyst that you have to manually do this. And why would we want to do that? Well, it depends. In some cases, you might say that, well, this is a very fairly, straightforward thing to us. This should never be open, just auto-remediate it. But in some cases, you might say that, well, this is a very critical infrastructure. We want to be absolutely sure that we don't block something that we shouldn't. So in those cases, we'll actually send an alert or an email or something like that to the analyst and say that you will manually have to choose whether or not to block this. So it's not like we're forcing full automation, we're enabling full automation, and you can put any manual check in wherever you want, which we'll also take a look at in the live demo. Right. One last thing. The previous example was when we talked to Prisma, but like I said, we can also talk directly to the cloud vendor, and it's basically exactly the same. That means that, of course, we'll get the alerts or information directly for AWS. We'll create the incident, we'll get the permissions, and so on and so forth. So we can also integrate directly into services, even if Prisma is not in place. But of course, Prisma will then give you a lot more overview and context that AWS doesn't do it on its own. So the point here, just to show you that we can integrate also natively if that's a requirement, or even in parallel if that's something that is interesting as well. Now, one of the great things about XSOAR is that it can be used for virtually anything. So we've shown two use cases. Obviously, XSOAR can be used for lots of different things. It can be used for automatically resolving phishing emails, for instance. It can be used to automatically resolve malware situation. It can be used for on and offboarding of users to ensure that all the policies and access are removed when he leaves or granted when he joins. But one of the big challenges is that we can see almost infinite number of use cases. It's entirely possible to use XSOAR, for instance, to brew your coffee in the morning before your first meeting. That's something I do personally. A bit expensive solution to do just for that, but it can be done. And we have also employees internally who are using this solution for their wedding invitations. So obviously, there are a lot of different use cases. So what we're doing is we're looking, of course, all the time into what kind of use cases can we build for you. We want to ensure that we provide and come up with new predefined use cases with playbooks, integrations, so on, that really makes your life easier. So we're looking into creating use cases with playbooks integration for access key compromise. How do we look at unpunched vulnerabilities? Can we auto-patch them? How about open buckets that are exposed to the internet, Kubernetes engines, misconfiguration around that, VPC misconfiguration, port scan, basically anything you can think of. Now, this is a huge, huge field, right? And of course, even Palo Alto can't create use cases for all of these things. That's why we have what we call the marketplace on XSOAR. So what I'm going to do now, since this now is the end of the actual PowerPoint presentation, I will now show you a tenant quickly first to show you, real time how potentially we could do an AWS remediation, for instance, and then I'll also show you the marketplace if that's interesting. So any questions before I stop here and basically log on to the XSOAR, as you can see here as well. Okay, so no questions yet. So now I can see the Q&A. I'm not sure why it didn't show up before, but I think I've answered the questions that are there. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so can you just verify that you're seeing the dashboard, please? If someone could just put it in the chat or somewhere, so I'm sure that I'm not, yeah, perfect, okay. Awesome. Thanks, guys. So what you can see here is a demo of XSOAR, but it's a live system. So obviously there's a lot of things I can click on and so on, but the purpose here was to show you an example of how an AWS issue can be resolved, for instance. So I'm going to go into the incidents tab. So the incidents tab is where we list all the incidents that have come in that have triggered a response, I would say. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fake that we get such an incident. So I'm going to click on new incident, and then I'm going to go here and I'm going to click on Prisma here and you create new incident. So this is the same as simulating that I'm getting an alert from Prisma that I need to react to. So now I'm going to click on refresh here, and then you can see my ticket ID, you can see the name, the type it's mapped to, the owner, and so on. And if I click on the ticket itself, I can go into what we call the work plan, which is sort of the playbook. And you can see it's actually now started. And the way it works now, it's now trying to go through the entire playbook. If all items were now fully automated, these will be now complete and everything was done. But like I mentioned before, some customers want some sort of human interaction. So when we have the orange one, there's a person here, it's now waiting for my input. So here we can see that what it has done is it set some policy recommendation, it has set some resource config, and now it's asking me, do you want to try auto resolution? So I'll click here, and I'll click yes, and mark complete. Now remember, also this step can be completely automated. So I'll do mark completed, and since I answered yes, it's now continuing down the yes path and now completed the full playbook. So you can see here, it then went in and updated the incident. It now runs a sub playbook. The blue here means a sub playbook. So if I do open sub playbook, we can see exactly what it did here. So now it is looking at the alert. It seems like the flow logs were not enabled. So it enabled the flow alert. It's now turned off the alert, set the issue to resolved, close notes, and so on. So I'll go back here. And it then continued and checked that the auto resolution worked and closed the incident. And apparently I'm awesome. It will tell you you're awesome as well if you invest in it. So it doesn't make any difference there. Now, of course, if you then had this as an automation part, what it does in this case, looking at the incident info, is that it detects that there's something wrong with the flow logs not being turned on. And this is a security breach to this organization. So if I didn't have the manual step there, which is easily changeable, this would just give me an information that we detected this, we fixed it, have a nice day. And this happens now in seconds, rather than some team member having to pull this up, trying to log on, see what's happened, getting more information, and then ultimately resolve the issue, which could take anything from 15 minutes to an hour, which you could be spending on something else that's more pressing. So this automation really saves time and can be heavily, of course, modified to do whatever you wish. So this is just a quick example of, for instance, we detected something wrong with WPC, flow logs not being turned on. We automatically fixed it. Have a nice day. So that, of course, saves a lot of time and repetitiveness and makes sure that everything is just peaky, of course, versus the requirements from this specific customer. So this is just an example. So let's see. Yes, questions, recording session, yes. Of course, the audio as well, yes, the entire session, including audio, will be shared, including what you're seeing now. The last thing I wanted to show you or touch a bit more upon was what I told you about the use cases. So the S in XSOAR stands for security, but personally, I feel that it's far too narrow, because if you look at all the integrations that we have in the solution here, if I go to integrations, you can see that we currently have 567 kinds of integrations. That's a very, very long list of integrations. Some will provide alerts, and some will provide us threat feeds, Some will be for automation, some will be for enrichments, but basically you can do anything with these integrations. It's easy to see what kind of API calls we can do and so on. And then it's just a matter of connecting to whatever you have internally and then providing playbooks, which basically then define how something is handled. As you saw before, this is an example playbook for malware that will do specific things to try to resolve the issue before it's done, obviously. And this doesn't necessarily have to be security. It could be onboarding, it could be offboarding of users, coffee making, wedding invitations, you name it. So in order to make sure that we then stay on top of use cases that are usable, we open the marketplace. So the marketplace in XSOAR is a place where we provide, of course, what we make free of charge, but also partners and customers can contribute here. So that means that it's a place where people can contribute, but partners can contribute with integrations, could be use cases, and most of them will be free. Some have a credit charge to them, so that doesn't go to us in such a manner. It's the contributor who decides what the cost is so in. If we then look at things like use cases, you can see that we have then different kinds of use cases. So for instance, if IAM is your thing, you'll click here and see there are multiple things you can try here. And all of them, including those that have some sort of a credit cost to them, will offer a 30-day free trial. So you can check whether or not this worked for you or not. So this grows really rapidly. So we're seeing a lot of vendors out there creating their own integrations, use cases, and putting them out there for you to use. So we'll be able to cover more use cases straight out of the box without you having to do anything. Now, there was a question about IBM QRadar. So let's go ahead and see. So under settings here, if you go to QRadar here, you can see that we have integrations for QRadar, and you can see that we can support any command that the API covers. And then, of course, we use the playbooks to run through and perform the specific actions here. So this is how it's put together: integrations, playbooks, and the automation part is the different kinds of actions we can perform based on the incidents that come in. And since we've pre-made so many of these things, both the integrations, the use cases, the playbooks, the automations, and everything, you can get running really, really fast. And if you need to make modifications, that's also really simple. So launch another site that I have to show you this specifically as well. So this is a demo where I have more write access. So just to show how easy it is to make changes. So let's say that you have a phishing use case and you have a playbook that you think is, this is pretty close to what I want to do. That was not the biggest one, so let me see if I can find a bigger one. So okay, I'm going to go a bit further. Let's see if I can find this one, for instance. So this is a bit more advanced. So maybe this fits almost your needs. Maybe you want to send an email between here, for instance. Now, you can either create your own, or you can very easily then, I just need to move some things here, go here and do duplicate. So I then duplicate the playbook, and I wait for it to create the duplicate. And then I can easily add my own things. So let's say that I like this playbook, but I want, for instance, to have an email being sent here, for instance. And I'll go here and just put in send, for instance. So I want to send using Gmail an email. So put add here, and then I can either predefine the fields or use the context fields. Okay. And then I'll just drag it to whatever place I want it to be. So let's see if I can find it here, down here, like so. And then I'll just either remove or add the new lines like this. And then I also have a make pretty button here, which then realigns everything. That's how easy it is to add, remove, or change playbooks without requiring you to understand any kind of coding at all. So there are some specific questions around this. How can I extract usernames on an email alert? Yeah, so we can parse emails directly. And we also have an auto extract fields, but you can also define which fields manually if you want to be very specific about what to extract. Now, to show this as well, and this is maybe a bit technical, but if we go into any incident here, we have something called context data. So this is going to be the last I show. This is a bit technical, but we auto extract information we get and put it into variables so that you can reference them in any point you want, making it really easy to manipulate, create, change, add your own kinds of playbooks without knowing coding. And if for some reason the item you're expecting isn't here, then it's easy to add manually. So I'm going to stop the demo there for fear of going too technically into it. But the point obviously is that we have pre-made so many things here that you can start running immediately without having to change or modify anything. And if you need to, it's very easy to manipulate, add things very visually. So any generic questions so that I don't go too technically into it? For those who want technical discussions, we're more than happy to do specific sessions for you where I can dive much further in and show you from an engineering perspective how to do things. Any high-level questions before I call it the day now? If there are no questions, I'm going to stop the recording. And please feel free to reach out, okay, by the email that you received in the invitation. And we can set up separate sessions for those who are interested, either if you want to go deeper or if you want to test the product or anything like that. So I hope this was useful. I thank you all for attending, and I wish you all a pleasant rest of the day.